So we really need to consider how the amount of money out there actually does have an impact on our GDP. And we're going to see more of this in Unit 6 as we talk about something known as monetary policy. But let's kind of start off by introducing this idea and just thinking about any money that people earn. Now, if you really think about it, whenever you earn money or you make money, you really got two things that you can do with it. One of those things is you can spend that money. And when you spend it, that has an impact on our GDP through consumer spending. But what happens if you save your money? What happens when you save your money? Now, typically when people save their money, it goes to the bank. But what impact does that have? Like, for example, whenever your money goes to the bank, what does the bank do with that money that you save? Well, unfortunately, the bank doesn't have like a little tiny vault with your name on it with just a little stack of cash in there. The bank actually uses your money to loan it out. Now, as we know, whenever you borrow something, if you go to the bank to borrow money, they're not just going to say like, "Oh yeah, here's 10,000 bucks, just get it back to us whenever you feel like it." No, what they do is you have to pay it back. And you not only have to pay it back, but you have to pay it back with something known as interest. So when banks loan out money, they charge a price for that loan. And that selling price for money, for borrowing money, is known as the interest rate. Now again, banks get that money to loan out from people like you and I. So as the suppliers of money, people who store their money at the bank get paid by the bank as well. They get paid a portion of that interest rate. The bank actually does pay people to keep their money at the bank. So as people store their money at the bank, banks give them an amount of interest. And a lot of that interest, where does the bank get that money? Well, because they end up loaning your money out. So, in the same way that we see back in Unit 2 with supply and demand, the forces of supply and demand take over whenever people and businesses either, store their money in a bank for it to be loaned out or whenever they borrow money. And that interest rate, the price of money, will change along with that. So let's take a look at how this works. Just like regular old supply and demand, we're going to have our money supply, we're going to have our money demand, right? So it's our demand for money and our supply of money. Now for the quantity, we're going to have the quantity, but it's going to be the quantity of money. But specifically, it's going to be the quantity of money that is available to be loaned out, right? Like the amount of money that people put into the banks that banks can then loan out. And then along our y-axis, we're going to have our price of money. And we said the price of money is the interest rate, right? So let's suppose that the equilibrium price right now, or the equilibrium interest rate, was 5%, meaning that if you wanted to borrow money, the price of that money, or the interest rate, is 5%. So if we were to consider that, that means that borrowers, or the demanders, must pay back 5% interest on that loan. Now this is compounding interest. We're not going to get into all of that, what that means, but let's just think about this being 5% back on whatever they borrow. Now, if you borrow that money, you have to pay that loan back with 5%, but the lenders or the suppliers get paid that 5%, right? Just like any other exchange, like if you were to go buy a pizza for 20 bucks, right? You pay $20 for that pizza. The person making the pizza, they get $20. The same thing is true with this interest rate. Now, remember, though, is that you are not directly loaning that money. The bank is doing it on your behalf. And so that interest rate ends up getting split between the bank and then the people who store their money at the bank. But let's take a look at a couple different scenarios of how this might change over time. Let's say that people saw this recession and they get a little spooked and they're like, listen, we want to start saving more of our money because we want to have like a little nest egg to keep us safe in the future in case something bad happens again. So that means the supply of money available at those banks is going to increase. It's going to shift to the right. And so now we have a new equilibrium. But what we end up seeing is that if banks were to keep their interest rate up there at 5%, they would have a surplus of money. They would just have money sitting around at the bank. And you're like, well, why is that a bad thing? Well, it's a bad thing because that money's not making any money for the bank. And so the bank wants to be able to loan out all this money, so they would have to lower the price of money. And so they lower the price of money, which is lowering the interest rate. Now, as that interest rate goes down, it becomes cheaper for people to want to borrow money. And now that it's cheaper, the quantity demanded of money is going to increase. More people want to borrow money from the bank. And so what we see is maybe more people would borrow money in order to, buy a house, or more businesses would borrow money in order to build a new factory or buy new machinery. And so as people change the amount of money that they're putting into the bank, it has an impact on interest rates and therefore how much money can be loaned out. The same thing can be true going the other direction. Suppose more businesses all of a sudden wanted to borrow to expand their production, and so the demand for money increases. Well, as we see the demand for money increases, if the amount of money at the bank doesn't change, that means banks would have a shortage of loanable funds. They'd have a shortage of money available. And so at that interest rate at 5%, it's too low, and so they would raise the price in order to cover that shortage. And as they increase that price, that interest rate, what we see is that the quantity supplied of money would also increase. Because before, maybe at 5%, I was like, you know what? I'm not getting all that much by storing my money at the bank. But as a supplier of money, now that the interest rate has gone up, I might be like, you know what? I'm better off storing my money at the bank than keeping it under my mattress or in my vault or whatever it might be. And so we end up seeing, again, like we said, the forces of supply and demand in action here that have an impact on the price of money or that interest rate. So how does this all play into what we call monetary expansion and monetary contraction? Well, here's what we're saying. As that money supply increases or the money demand decreases, that's going to have the same impact on the price of money, right? Both of those are going to cause interest rates or the price of money. It's going to cause that interest rate to go down. Banks now have more money to loan out, or maybe they don't necessarily have more money, but what we end up seeing is they might just have an excess amount of money available. And so that's going to drive down the price of money. Now, as interest rates go down, there is more incentive for individuals and businesses to borrow money. And as there's more incentive for them to borrow money, investment's going to increase. Well, as we know, investment is part of our GDP. And as investment increases, GDP is going to increase. And so what we're saying is that change in supply or demand can have an impact on our GDP in the end. The same thing is true if the money supply was to go down or if the money demand was to go up. Both of those would result in less money being available to loan out, specifically if the money supply was to go down, or there's just not enough money to go around if the money demand increases. And so interest rates would be driven up, which means there'd be less investment because it's now more expensive to borrow money. And that would result in our GDP going down. And so again, we can see that these monetary expansions or contractions, whatever ends up happening, they can have an ultimate impact on our GDP. And we're really going to see this again play out in Unit 6 as we talk about monetary and fiscal policy.